June 28th, 1944. The morning mist still clings to the hedgerows outside Saint-Lô. Silver threads of fog caught between the wreckage of burned-out tanks. In the shattered remains of a stone farmhouse, Oberleutnant Karl Fischer presses his ear against the damp wall, listening to the distant thud of American mortars. His men whisper nearby, their voices brittle with exhaustion. They've held this position for 3 nights, longer than anyone expected, and now the forest seems to hum with something unfamiliar. Then it comes, a sharp hiss, not the screech of artillery, not the crack of rifle fire, but something swift, intimate, electric. Fischer turns toward the sound, just as a flash slices through the rain-slick field. A split second later, the far corner of the barn disappears in a blast of smoke and orange light. The air compresses. Shards of slate and timber rain down. One of his gunners stumbles backward, eyes wide, uniform smoldering. The weapon that did this is invisible, handheld, and impossibly fast. Was war us? Fischer mutters. What was that? But no one answers. They've fought against American infantry before, endured artillery and airstrikes, but this is something else. He peers through his binoculars, spotting movement, silhouettes ducking between hedgerows, crouched, tubes slung over shoulders. They're advancing without tanks. From captured diaries found later, historians would note how this moment rippled through German lines like rumor and wildfire, stories of ghost fire that tore through steel as if it were paper. That morning, even the veterans stopped trusting their bunkers. Fischer steps outside, boots sinking in the wet soil, the smell of burned fuel thick in his lungs. He looks toward the rising smoke, listening again for that hiss, the sound that now marks the boundary between the old war and the new. Before we move deeper into this forgotten story, subscribe to POW Tales, where real history speaks. And beyond the smoke, the story of the bazooka's arrival in Normandy truly begins. By late June 1944, the Normandy campaign had turned into a brutal test of endurance. The German command had expected the Allies to break quickly against the Atlantic Wall, but instead, waves of American infantry poured through the gaps, pushing deeper each day. Roads once lined with apple trees now ran black with mud and diesel. The air carried a sour tang of cordite, mixed with the sweet rot of abandoned fields. In the chaos, one detail began to surface in German situation reports: a new American rocket device capable of piercing our armor. Wehrmacht officers dismissed the early accounts as exaggerations. They had faced the Americans in North Africa and Italy. Their infantry were brave but predictable, their weapons conventional. Yet the field notes arriving from frontline units told a different story. Single soldiers are able to disable half-tracks, one report read, with a weapon small enough to carry on the shoulder. At first, German intelligence officers in Saint-Lô believed the descriptions referred to the Panzerschreck, their own rocket launcher, reverse-engineered from an early American model captured in Tunisia. But the damage reports didn't match. The impacts were cleaner, more precise, often hitting weak points that experienced anti-tank crews would never target by chance. Somewhere in the smoke of Normandy, the Americans had mastered their own design, the M1A1 Bazooka, and were using it with uncanny precision. Captured fragments of spent tubes collected by engineers near Carentan confirmed it. Smooth-bore launchers, lightweight, firing-shaped charges capable of penetrating over 3 inches of steel. It wasn't the scale of the weapon that frightened the officers, it was its simplicity. Any infantryman could carry one, aim it, and change the shape of a battle in seconds. The shift was psychological as much as tactical. For the first time, German armor crews began to hesitate before advancing. Tanks that once rolled confidently through infantry lines now lingered at the edge of villages, waiting for cover that never came. Diaries found after the war record tank commanders refusing to enter narrow roads or dense hedgerows, fearful of invisible fire. The hissing sound became an omen, a ghost's whisper that preceded destruction. Across the front, American soldiers were learning the same weapon from the opposite side, not as myth, but as salvation. To them, the bazooka was the equalizer. It allowed undertrained riflemen to stand against steel giants. Private George Latham of the 29th Infantry Division wrote home, "We carry pipes that spit thunder. Jerry doesn't like them much." His letter, now preserved in the National Archives, is smudged with oil and dirt, as if written in haste between shellings. For Carl Fischer and the men of his command, however, the weapon remained a mystery. Each encounter was more devastating than the last, and in the coming days, the rumors from intelligence reports would meet reality at the edge of his command post, where the Americans were preparing their next push through the bocage. The fields were quiet for now, filled only with the hum of flies and the distant echo of artillery. But beneath that stillness, history was coiling like a fuse. The days following that first encounter blurred into a rhythm of bombardment and uneasy silence. Every dusk brought new whispers through the German ranks, of soldiers burned alive inside their armored carriers, of positions destroyed without warning. The officers tried to keep order with clipped commands and calm gestures, but their eyes betrayed them. In the hedgerows, superstition grew as fast as fear. Carl Fischer, a career officer who had once prided himself on precision and composure, found himself grasping for logic. His field radio crackled with overlapping reports. Enemy infantry advancing without armor. New explosive device, shoulder fired, unknown type, possible British origin. He jotted the phrases into his notebook, pressing the pencils so hard the paper tore. The Wehrmacht had spent years mastering mechanical warfare, the calculated interplay of artillery, tanks, and aircraft, but this new sound on the battlefield had rewritten the rules. In one intercepted American report, later recovered from abandoned vehicles, U.S. engineers described their growing confidence in the bazooka's range and reliability. The document, now archived at the Imperial War Museum, noted how the weapon functions best at 50 to 75 yards, ideal for ambush within hedgerow country. The Americans were learning to use Normandy itself, its narrow lanes, thick walls of vegetation, and sudden clearings, as part of their strategy. It was terrain made for ghosts, with rocket tubes. German countermeasures arrived swiftly but clumsily. Officers ordered sandbags lashed to tank hulls, welded screens to half-tracks, and distributed leaflets instructing infantry to aim low and fire preemptively into the foliage. Nothing helped. When the hiss came, it was already too late. The shaped charge didn't rely on brute force. It focused energy, like a lens turning sunlight into fire. Armor was no longer armor. Meanwhile, the Americans adapted faster. Training films circulated through divisions, showing soldiers firing bazookas from ditches, windows, and even trees. A U.S. ordnance officer, quoted in a post-war Army report, described the weapon as a miracle of simplicity and courage, the everyman's artillery. For a nation of farmhands and factory workers thrust into Europe, It was the perfect equalizer. Fisher's battalion was ordered to hold the outskirts of a small crossroads near Le Désert, a nameless patch of mud that now carried the weight of history. The roads were clogged with refugees, the fields cratered with smoke. He could see the glint of binoculars from the opposite tree line, American scouts marking their next target. That night, as rain swept across the ridge, Fisher stood beside his sergeant under the fractured remains of a telegraph pole. "They've learned faster than we can adapt," he murmured. The sergeant said nothing. Somewhere in the distance, another hiss sliced through the storm, faint but unmistakable. By dawn, the Americans would be in the fields again, crawling forward with rocket tubes on their shoulders and determination in their eyes. The line between defender and survivor was about to vanish completely. The morning began with fog, a dense, colorless veil that made sound feel close, almost trapped. Carl Fisher stood at the edge of a collapsed trench, the damp earth crumbling beneath his boots, staring into that gray silence. His company had been reduced by half. Some men had fled under cover of night. Others lay buried beneath splintered beams and overturned vehicles. The field telephone had gone dead hours ago. All that remained was the instinct to hold ground, even when the ground itself seemed to shudder. Then came that hiss again. It began like a snake's breath, invisible and intimate, rising from somewhere unseen. Fisher dropped instinctively, pressing his face into the mud, just as a nearby armored carrier burst into flame. The explosion tore open the fog, revealing the silhouettes of advancing Americans, helmets low, bodies crouched, moving with a purpose that felt unnervingly methodical. They weren't charging, they were hunting. His sergeant screamed orders, but the men barely moved. They had seen too much, too quickly. The smell of scorched metal carried across the trench, mingled with the acrid bite of burning fuel. Somewhere behind him, a young soldier named Weber muttered a prayer, his hands shaking as he reloaded his rifle. The officer wanted to shout at him, to command him back to duty. But what command could hold against the sound of that hiss? In the distance, one of their Panzer IVs tried to maneuver into position. Fisher watched the turret turn toward the hedgerow, its barrel trembling slightly from the engine's strain. Then, another flash. The rocket struck just below the turret ring, the shaped charge cutting through steel like paper. The tank buckled, the hatch burst open, and a plume of black smoke twisted upward, carrying with it the faint echo of human voices. In that moment, the officer understood something unspoken. This was not just a new weapon, it was a psychological fracture. Men could prepare for artillery, for tanks, even for death by air raid. But this was personal. It was a soldier against a ghost. Later, in his field diary recovered from the ruins, Fisher's last legible line reads, "We can no longer tell where safety begins or ends." The words trail off in smudged pencil as if interrupted mid-thought. The Americans pressed forward, step by step, through what remained of the village. Each launch lit the mist for a second, a brief flare of blue fire, followed by silence and collapse. And as the day dragged on, that hiss became more than sound. It became a rhythm, a heartbeat of destruction, echoing through the fog-choked valleys of Normandy. For Fisher's men, descent wasn't a fall. It was a slow, sound-guided unraveling. And by nightfall, the officer would learn that survival demanded something worse than courage. It demanded surrender to uncertainty itself. By the second night, the battlefield no longer felt like a place, but a presence. A living thing that inhaled fear and exhaled silence. The fog had thickened again, heavy and low, masking both enemy and ally. Carl Fischer crawled through the debris of what used to be a defensive line, the earth slick with oil and rain. Every few yards, his hand brushed against something familiar, a helmet, a rifle, a fragment of uniform, but he no longer paused to check who it belonged to. There was no sense in counting names when the day itself had forgotten them. The hiss came sporadically now, distant but constant, like the pulse of an unseen predator circling its prey. Each detonation painted the horizon in dull orange flashes, followed by the drawn-out groan of collapsing walls. His ears rang from the echoes, his mouth tasted of soot. Every man still standing had the same hollow stare, wide eyes, slow blinks, a kind of silent confession that courage had run dry. At midnight, Fischer found cover beside a wrecked half-track. The metal was still warm from a recent blast. Nearby, his radio operator, a boy barely 19, tried to tune the field set, fingers trembling as static filled the air. "They're close," the boy whispered. Fischer nodded. Though he couldn't see the Americans anymore, he could feel them, moving like shadows between the hedgerows, guided by that strange new confidence that comes when fear changes sides. In his exhaustion, Fischer tried to remember the briefings from months before, the talk of German superiority, of iron discipline, and mechanized precision. Those words now felt distant, hollow, like relics from another war. What mattered here wasn't ideology or strategy. It was instinct. And the Americans, for all their roughness and noise, had found a rhythm that Germany's clockwork machine could no longer match. A sudden blast threw dirt over his helmet. The boy beside him slumped forward, silent. Fischer froze. The air smelled of singed cloth and ozone, the aftertaste of a bazooka's ignition. He felt an irrational anger rise within him, not at the enemy, but at the absurdity of it all. That a weapon so small could undo years of doctrine and pride in seconds. Hours later, as dawn crept over the ridge, the fog began to lift, revealing the wreckage in full. Tanks lay like gutted beasts across the road, their armor warped and blistered. The farmhouse that once served as his command post was now a mound of broken stone. Somewhere within it, the sound of dripping water mingled with the faint hiss of burning fuel. He stood there, motionless, the rifle heavy in his hands. Around him, the survivors moved like ghosts, men stripped of certainty, clinging only to the next breath. The descent was complete, though the war was far from over, and as the light grew stronger, Fischer realized that even daylight could no longer promise safety. The next days would bring not just repetition, but routine, the numbing ritual of endurance that kept soldiers alive long after reason had left them. By early July, the thunder of battle had settled into a cruel kind of rhythm. Each day began the same. The low hum of Allied aircraft at dawn, the distant chatter of machine guns after sunrise, and then the quiet stretches. Those deceptive silences where men waited for death without realizing they were still breathing. For Carl Fischer and what was left of his unit, survival had become mechanical, stripped of pride or purpose. Their new position was a sunken road lined with chest-high hedgerows, a natural trench carved by centuries of farm wagons. The walls were thick with roots and damp earth, muffling every sound but their own. The men worked without speaking, stacking ammunition, patching uniforms, boiling rainwater for soup. Every so often, someone would pause and glance toward the tree line, half expecting that familiar hiss, to cut through the stillness. Fisher kept a small notebook tucked inside his tunic. Once filled with orders and coordinates, it now held only fragments of thought. Too quiet today. No word from command. Fuel gone. The handwriting grew smaller with each page, as if he were trying to hide the words from himself. Occasionally, an American shell would land close enough to shake the walls of their refuge. Dust would rain down from the hedgerows like dry snow, and for a moment, everyone froze, until they realized it wasn't the bazooka's hiss. Then came the faint laughter, brittle but real. One soldier, a former schoolteacher from Bremen, joked that they should name the next rocket the Invisible Death. Another replied, "No, the American Whistle." Even in despair, humor was their last defense. Night brought its own rhythm. The wounded muttered in their sleep. The rest smoked rationed cigarettes, the tips glowing like tiny beacons in the dark. Fisher watched them from a few paces away, listening to the soft rustle of paper and the occasional murmur of a prayer. Somewhere beyond the hedgerow, frogs croaked in the flooded fields, a sound so ordinary it almost felt cruel. In moments like this, the war seemed to pause, suspended between horror and habit. Fisher thought about his home near Hamburg, the river, the quiet streets, his wife's letters folded neatly in his pack. He had stopped reading them weeks ago, not out of indifference, but because hope had become too heavy to carry. Every day blurred into the next, each marked by the same pattern. Dig, watch, wait, brace. The men no longer spoke of victory or retreat, only of making it to nightfall. The sound of the bazooka had changed them. It wasn't just a weapon now. It was a memory that haunted even silence. When dawn came again, the mist was lighter, and the birds dared to sing for the first time in days. For a fleeting moment, it felt almost peaceful. Then the air shifted, that faint tremor, like pressure before a storm. Fisher's eyes flicked toward the horizon. Routine, he realized, was only the illusion between two explosions. The next morning unfolded like a cruel repetition of the last. The men rose in silence, their movements synchronized not by command, but by instinct. Boots scraped against wet soil, rifles were checked by touch, and ration tins opened with dull metallic clicks that sounded louder than gunfire in the still air. The fog that once cloaked them had thinned, leaving only smoke from smoldering wrecks drifting across the fields. Fisher climbed from the sunken road to scan the horizon. Through his binoculars, he saw the distant glint of helmets, American patrols moving carefully between hedgerows. They weren't advancing in columns anymore. They worked in pairs, disciplined and deliberate, each man carrying something slung across his back, a rocket tube or its replacement. They looked young, almost too young for the burden of war, yet their confidence was unmistakable. They knew what they carried changed everything. Behind Fisher, his men were rebuilding a makeshift bunker from the ruins of a cart shed. The structure leaned like a dying animal, patched with sandbags and rusted corrugated metal. They worked slowly, more from habit than hope. Each strike of a shovel sounded like a heartbeat. Each breath of wind carried the echo of the past day's screams. Occasionally, one of the soldiers would light a cigarette and pass it down the line, a wordless act of defiance against the chaos. Smoke curled through the damp air, mingling with the scent of soil and diesel. Fisher accepted a drag when it reached him, feeling the heat on his lips, the smoke burning his lungs. For a brief second, he felt human again. Then came the distant thud of artillery, and the spell broke. That afternoon, A messenger arrived from Divisional Command, his uniform torn, his face streaked with mud. He brought no supplies, only new orders. Hold position at all costs. Fisher read the paper twice, the ink already smudged by rain. "Hold what?" he whispered, but the messenger was already gone, limping back toward the chaos that had sent him. By evening, the men had stopped counting time. Hunger and fatigue blurred the edges of thought. Some sat with their backs against the hedgerows, staring into nothing. Others scratched messages into their helmets. Names, prayers, fragments of memory. One carved a single word. Heimat. Home. The only constant was the anticipation, that unbearable waiting for the sound that always came. And when it did, the hiss was softer this time, almost gentle, like breath drawn before confession. A flash followed, brief but absolute. The new bunker folded inward, swallowed by flame. No one screamed. They simply scattered, their motions rehearsed by repetition. Fisher hit the ground, covering his head as dirt rained down. His heart pounded not from fear, but from recognition. The routine had become prophecy. Every gesture, every silence, every night of pretending they could adapt, it all led back to this sound. When the smoke cleared, he found himself alone, beside a shattered wall. The hedgerows glowed faintly from the fires, painting the sky with a dull amber haze. He wiped the grit from his eyes, staring into the distance, where American flares marked the next line of advance. In that flickering light, he understood. The days of mechanical war were over. The future belonged to whoever could carry fire on their shoulder and walk through fear unshaken. Tomorrow, the pattern would begin again, but something inside him had already shifted. The routine was now resistance, and survival itself had become an act of defiance. The next sunrise would not bring calm, only the moment that would break this fragile rhythm forever. July 10th, 1944. The sky over Normandy hung low and heavy, the color of wet iron. Overnight rain had turned the roads into shallow rivers of mud, glistening beneath a pale, reluctant dawn. Carl Fisher stood with his remaining men in the hollow of a field bordered by twisted trees. Their orders were to hold the junction, a cluster of farmhouses that no longer resembled homes, until reinforcements arrived. But no one truly believed reinforcements were coming. The men spoke little. Each face was streaked with soot and grime, eyes sunken from sleepless nights. Fisher felt the weight of his pistol at his side, not as a weapon, but as a quiet reminder of duty and of endings. He could hear distant engines growling beyond the hedgerows, a deep rumble, followed by the faint staccato of American rifles. The enemy was close, closer than ever. He crouched behind the remnants of a stone wall, scanning the mist for movement. For a while, there was nothing, only the drip of rain from shattered roof tiles. Then, through the smoke, he saw them, figures moving low, crawling through ditches, their shapes distorted by fog. One paused, lifted a long tube to his shoulder. Fisher's breath caught. That hiss, again. The rocket streaked across the clearing, striking the far wall of a barn where two of his men had taken cover. The explosion tore the building open like paper. The sound arrived a second later, a hollow, crushing roar that seemed to swallow the world. Fisher was thrown backward, his ears ringing, his vision swimming in dust and flame. When the air cleared, the barn was gone. Only fragments remained, burning quietly. The men who had been inside were nowhere. The others stared, motionless, as if afraid to believe what they'd seen. Fisher forced himself to stand, tasting blood. "Positions," he shouted, though his voice cracked mid-word. His men scrambled into cover, but their movements were hesitant, slow. The old discipline had fractured. He looked toward the smoke, searching for the Americans, and caught sight of something strange. An American soldier crouched behind a stump, struggling to reload his bazooka. His hands trembled. For a fleeting second, Fisher saw not an enemy, but a reflection. A boy driven by orders, caught between fear and necessity. Their eyes met through the haze, and then the boy ducked away, disappearing into the fog. Something inside Fisher broke loose then. Not despair, but understanding. The war had become something else entirely. It was no longer about territory or ideology. It was about endurance, about who could keep standing when the world refused to make sense. He pressed his hand to the charred wall beside him. It was warm, almost pulsing, as if the earth itself shared the pain. In that moment, Fisher realized that he had been fighting not just the Americans, but time, the slow, inevitable turning of the world towards something new. The hiss came again, this time from behind. He dropped into the mud as another explosion ripped through the farmhouse. Debris rained down in burning fragments. When he opened his eyes, the sky above was black with smoke, and the air reeked of gunpowder and rain. The turning point had arrived, sudden, absolute, and inescapable. And somewhere in that chaos, amid the ruin and fire, Fisher would have to decide whether to cling to the past or face what waited beyond the next hiss. Fisher crawled through the rubble, his hands raw from gripping stones and splintered beams. The air was thick with dust and the metallic scent of blood. Somewhere behind him, someone was calling his name, or maybe just screaming. It didn't matter. The world had narrowed to sound and instinct, to the pounding in his ears and the faint crackle of fire. He found what remained of their radio, buried under a collapsed beam. Its casing was bent, antenna snapped. He brushed away the debris and pressed the transmitter, whispering, "This is Lieutenant Carl Fisher, 7th Company. We are under heavy—" The signal died in static. No one was listening anymore. A shell landed nearby, shaking the earth. Fisher ducked, covering his head. When the echo faded, he saw movement again. The Americans were advancing. Slow, methodical, crouched behind the smoldering remains of the barn. Their coordination was frighteningly precise. Each rocket launch was followed by a wave of riflemen, their silhouettes merging with smoke like ghosts given purpose. Fisher turned to his men. What was left of them? 7 soldiers, tired, soot-covered, hollow-eyed. One, barely 20, clutched his rifle as if it were a lifeline. Another, a veteran sergeant, muttered prayers under his breath. Fisher looked at them and saw not soldiers, but survivors, fragments of an army that no longer existed. "Fall back to the trench line," he ordered, his voice low but firm. "Move quietly." They moved like shadows through the debris, slipping into the narrow ditch that curved behind the orchard. As they crawled, another hiss sliced through the air. Fisher turned just in time to see a rocket hit the ground where they'd been seconds before. The explosion lifted earth and flames skyward, showering them in mud. The young soldier beside him trembled uncontrollably. "They don't miss any more," he whispered. Fisher didn't answer. He couldn't. Instead, he reached over and gripped the boy's shoulder, a wordless gesture that said everything command structure could not. "You're still here. Keep breathing." They reached the trench line, little more than a scar in the earth, and took positions. Across the field, the Americans advanced, pausing only to reload. Fisher could see them clearly now. Helmets low, uniforms streaked with rain and grime. One carried the tube, another the rockets. They moved like hunters who had learned their prey's rhythm. "Wait for them to cross the ditch," Fisher said, raising his rifle. The others followed suit, nerves taut. The rain began again, soft and steady, masking their breathing. Then came the moment. The Americans stepped into the open. Fisher fired first. His shot dropped one of them instantly. The rest scattered, returning fire. The firefight was short, brutal. The Germans fought with desperation, the Americans with momentum. Within minutes, Fisher's ammunition was nearly gone. He ducked, fumbling for another clip, when a nearby explosion knocked him backward into the trench wall. His helmet flew off, his vision blurred. Through the haze, he saw an American soldier approaching, the same young man he'd glimpsed before, the one with the trembling hands. Their eyes met again. The boy hesitated, lowering his weapon for the briefest heartbeat. Fisher froze, drenched in rain and disbelief. Then the boy raised the bazooka again. A sound, a breath, a hiss, filled the space between them. Fisher closed his eyes. But the rocket never came. A shout echoed from behind the American. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" The boy turned, startled, and Fisher took that moment to crawl backward into the mud, dragging himself toward the tree line. When he finally stopped, chest heaving, he looked back once more at the battlefield. Smoke drifted lazily upward, mingling with the rain. The Americans were no longer firing. They were tending to their wounded, moving cautiously among the ruins. For the first time in days, the world was quiet. Fisher sat there in the mud, staring through the smoke, and realized the truth. The Germans had not lost this fight because of cowardice or poor tactics. They had lost because the world had changed, and they hadn't. The age of fire and armor was over. The age of the rocket had begun. The forest beyond the orchard had turned into a maze of shattered trees and shallow craters, each one filled with rainwater, reflecting the dull light of dawn. Lieutenant Carl Fisher stumbled through it, his uniform soaked, his boots heavy with mud. Behind him, the echoes of artillery still pulsed faintly, a dying heartbeat of a battle that had already chosen its victor. He paused at a fallen oak and pressed his back against the trunk, trying to steady his breathing. Every nerve screamed exhaustion. His rifle hung uselessly from its strap. His ammunition was gone. In his coat pocket, the torn photograph of his wife and infant daughter was now little more than a smear of paper. He touched it briefly, as if the gesture could somehow keep the world from erasing them too. The silence around him was deceptive, a living thing. Somewhere far off, he could hear the rumble of American tanks, slow and methodical, flattening what was left of the road. Between the trees came faint voices. English, calm, assured. Fisher ducked lower. He knew the Americans wouldn't fire on a surrendering officer. But surrender didn't feel like survival. It felt like burial. Hours blurred. The rain stopped. Then came the smell. Smoke and fuel mixed with the metallic tang of destruction. Fisher crept closer to the sound until the trees opened onto a clearing where he saw them. A column of U.S. infantry assembling near a wrecked barn, their uniforms streaked with ash. At the front stood a sergeant with a bazooka slung over his shoulder, laughing with another soldier as they shared a canteen. Fisher watched them, transfixed. The tube that had destroyed his defense line now hung casually against a man's hip, no more remarkable than a shovel. The casualness struck him like a revelation. How ordinary Apocalypse had become. He remembered his orders. Hold the line. Resist at all costs. Buy time for retreat. Those words now seemed absurd, like a sermon delivered to a graveyard. He looked down at his hands, cracked and caked with dirt, and wondered when they had stopped belonging to a soldier. The Americans began moving again, their convoy stretching toward the road that led west. Fisher knew that following them would mean capture, but staying meant starvation, isolation, and perhaps worse, the Soviets were not far behind. Between those two fates lay the thin, uncertain thread of survival. He tore off his insignia, buried his pistol beneath a pile of leaves, and began walking, not toward the Americans, not away, but parallel to their path. For 2 days, he moved like a shadow through the ravaged countryside, sleeping in barns, drinking from ditches, avoiding both sides. Along the way, he passed others, German stragglers, some wounded, some dazed, all hollowed by defeat. None spoke. Words had become too heavy to carry. On the third morning, he came across a farmhouse still standing, its windows cracked but intact. Smoke rose from the chimney, a miracle of normalcy. He approached cautiously, hands raised. A woman answered the door, her expression guarded, but not hostile. She was older, perhaps in her 50s, wrapped in a wool shawl. "Water," Fisher rasped. She hesitated, then nodded and handed him a tin cup. The water tasted clean and impossibly kind. "War's finished here," she said quietly, her German tinged with a local dialect. "Americans took the town yesterday. They don't shoot prisoners." Fisher lowered the cup. "And the wounded?" "They take them too. Feed them." She studied him. "You should go before others come." He nodded. "Danke." She watched him step back into the grey morning, her eyes carrying that strange mixture of pity and exhaustion that civilians reserve for men who have lost both their war and their purpose. As he walked, he began to hear it, a sound unlike any gunfire or shell. It was a distant hum, rhythmic, mechanical, and growing louder. Fisher looked up and saw the source, a column of American trucks moving along the ridge road. On their flatbeds sat prisoners, German soldiers, unarmed, wrapped in blankets, their faces blank but alive. The sight brought him to his knees. For the first time, the word liberation did not seem to belong solely to the victors. He raised his hands as the convoy drew near, stepping into the open, unarmed. A voice shouted from the first truck, "Hold it there!" followed by the unmistakable sound of rifles being cocked. Fisher froze, heart hammering. Then one of the soldiers recognized the insignia still faintly visible on his coat sleeve. "He's Wehrmacht," the man said. "He's done." They lowered their weapons. A young corporal climbed down from the truck, offered him a cigarette, and said simply, "You're lucky, Kraut. War's over for you." Fisher took the cigarette but didn't light it. He looked at the soldier, maybe 20, the same age as the boy with the bazooka. "Over," he repeated softly, as if testing whether the word could hold meaning anymore. In the distance, the morning sun broke through the clouds, striking the wrecked fields in long golden lines. For the first time in weeks, Fisher allowed himself to breathe. The American convoy rumbled westward, leaving the shattered village behind. Fisher sat in the back of one of the trucks, surrounded by dozens of German prisoners, officers, infantrymen, boys too young to shave, men too old to march. The vehicle smelled of sweat, oil, and damp wool. Every bump in the road sent a shudder through the silent crowd. No one spoke. Words had become irrelevant in a world where even survival felt like theft. He looked down at his hands, trembling, filthy, blistered. They no longer resembled the hands of a soldier. The skin was grey, the veins dark and raised. He wondered what those same hands had done only days before, signing orders, holding a rifle, gripping the cold edge of a helmet. Now, they just lay there, limp, like tools left behind after a job too terrible to name. The trucks passed burned-out fields where once there had been wheat, now reduced to ash. Occasionally, they drove by groups of civilians, women with scarves tied over their hair, children clutching loaves of bread, men who stared without expression. The victors and the defeated were indistinguishable now, all equally grey under the sky's relentless pallor. One of the prisoners, a corporal from the Panzer Division, whispered, "They're taking us to a camp near Verdun." Heard it from one of the guards. His voice was hoarse, the words brittle. Fisher nodded, though he wasn't sure he cared where they were going. Verdun, Normandy, America, every name now belonged to the same geography of surrender. As they rolled past a small ridge, Fisher's eyes caught movement. A column of American engineers clearing wreckage, dragging broken tanks off the road with steel cables. One of them carried a bazooka slung over his shoulder, the same weapon that had shattered his defense line, silenced his command, and rewritten the rhythm of battle itself. Fisher watched in silence. The soldier was laughing, joking with his comrades. There was no sense of triumph, only relief, the relief of men who had survived the machinery of annihilation. Fisher realized then that the weapon he had feared most was not born of hatred, but of necessity, an invention of men who simply wanted to end what should never have begun. The convoy halted near a crossroads, guarded by American MPs. Orders were exchanged. One by one, the prisoners were told to step down. Fisher climbed out, his legs trembling. The camp was visible ahead, a sea of tents and barbed wire set against the rolling fields of eastern France. As they entered, a sergeant took their names. When Fisher spoke his, Lieutenant Karl Fischer, 7th Infantry Wehrmacht. The sergeant nodded without looking up. Another guard handed Fisher a tin plate and pointed toward a line of steaming pots. The smell of food, real food, hit him like a blow. He stood in line, waiting. Around him, men wept quietly, though none knew why. Some from relief, others from shame. When it was his turn, Fisher accepted a ladle of soup, thin, hot, miraculous. He sat beneath a canvas awning, the rain pattering softly on the fabric above, and sipped. Across from him sat a young American guard, perhaps the same age as the boy who had once aimed the bazooka at him. The guard studied him for a moment, then asked, "You were an officer?" "Yes," Fisher said quietly. "Hell of a fight back there." Fisher looked up, meeting the young man's eyes. "You changed everything," he said, almost to himself. The guard shrugged. "That rocket, just metal and powder, sir. The rest, that's all people." That simple answer struck deeper than any shell. Fisher stared at the grey horizon, where the smoke of war still rose faintly in the distance. The world had indeed changed, not because of the weapons themselves, but because of the will of the men who built and bore them. When night fell, the camp grew quiet. The guards walked their patrols. The prisoners huddled in their tents. Fisher lay awake, the thin blanket drawn to his chin, listening to the hum of generators and the distant murmur of English voices. He thought of his home, his wife, his daughter. Perhaps somewhere they still lived. Perhaps the same sun that rose over this field of surrender would touch their faces too. The thought gave him something that almost felt like warmth. In the darkness, Fisher whispered a line he had once read in a soldier's diary, long before the front collapsed. "The war will end, but the memory will not." And for the first time, he understood what it meant. The next morning, as dawn broke over the camp, the sound of boots on gravel signaled another roll call. Fisher rose, steadying himself. Beyond the barbed wire, the American flag fluttered in the light breeze. Its fabric caught the early sun, a symbol not of conquest, but of endurance. He watched it for a long time, and somewhere inside him, something loosened, the final thread binding him to the illusion that war could ever be won. The war ended for Lieutenant Carl Fisher, not with a gunshot or a surrender signed in ink, but with the morning call of birds over a prisoner camp in eastern France. The world outside was rearranging itself, cities clearing rubble, trains rolling again, letters finding their way to homes that no longer existed. Inside the wire, life was measured by soup lines and sunsets, by the rhythm of survival stripped bare of ideology. Fisher spent his days quietly, assigned to repair duty near the camp's edge. The work was simple: mending fences, cleaning ditches, hauling scrap. His uniform was gone now, replaced by a rough brown shirt with a number stitched at the chest. He didn't mind. In fact, the absence of rank brought a strange calm. For the first time in years, no one was giving orders, and no one was listening for them. Each morning he watched the Americans in their routines, young men with the casual energy of those ready to go home. They smoked, joked, shared photographs of wives or girlfriends. To Fisher, they no longer seemed like enemies. They were simply men who had survived the same storm, washed up on opposite shores of the same tide. At dusk, he would sit by the fence and stare at the horizon, where the sky turned the color of burned copper. The sound of distant engines reminded him of the bazookas, that weapon which had seemed so monstrous in the heat of battle. Now, stripped of fear, he saw it for what it truly was, a sign that the world had outgrown him. Sometimes he would think back to the orchard, to the mud, the smoke, the face of the young American who had spared him. He wondered what had stayed the boy's hand that day: mercy, exhaustion, or the simple realization that no weapon could claim victory over another man's humanity. That thought lingered like an ember, refusing to fade. Weeks passed. The camp gates opened gradually, releasing prisoners in batches. One by one, men left, with stamped papers and hollow eyes, returning to a country that no longer recognized itself. Fisher waited, uncertain what he would do when his turn came. The letters from home had not arrived. He imagined his wife searching the lists, his daughter growing up without memory of him. The ache was constant, but dull, softened by routine. Then, one evening, as he stood near the mess tent, an American officer approached with a clipboard. "Fisher, Carl?" he asked. Fisher nodded. "You're cleared. Transport leaves at dawn." The words felt unreal. He simply said, "Danke," though he knew the man wouldn't understand. The officer smiled anyway, a small, human gesture that crossed language. That night, Fisher couldn't sleep. He sat outside his tent, watching the camp lights flicker. Around him, others murmured softly, plans, hopes, guesses. He said nothing. Freedom, after all, was not something you reclaimed overnight. When morning came, the trucks were waiting by the gate. Fisher climbed aboard, joining dozens of others. The engine started with a deep growl. As the convoy rolled forward, he looked back one last time at the camp, the wire, the towers, the muddy yard where he had rebuilt himself piece by piece. He realized then that the place which had imprisoned him had also preserved him. The trucks drove east for hours through countryside, reborn in spring. Farmers were ploughing again, children waved from the roadside. Life, absurdly, beautifully, had continued. By afternoon, they reached a rail depot. Fisher stepped down, feeling the solid ground beneath his boots as something almost holy. A Red Cross worker handed him a slip of paper. Repatriation to Munich district. She spoke kindly, as if to a man returning from a long illness. He thanked her, folded the paper, and tucked it into his coat. The train that would take him home waited nearby, its carriages already half full of men staring out the windows in silence. Fisher found a seat by the door and watched as the landscape rolled past. Fields, rivers, villages. Everywhere he looked, the scars of war mingled with signs of renewal. And in that motion, he felt something stirring inside. Not pride, not sorrow, but a fragile kind of peace. As dusk fell, the train slowed near a bend, where the tracks cut through a valley filled with wild flowers. The air through the open window was cool and fragrant. Fisher closed his eyes and for the first time in years allowed himself to believe that life might still hold meaning beyond orders, beyond survival, beyond the roar of rockets. The sound of the wheels on the tracks reminded him faintly of rain, soft, rhythmic, endless. The train carried Carl Fisher through the scarred heart of Germany, towns reduced to skeletons, fields pocked with bomb craters, and bridges standing half-collapsed over sluggish rivers. Yet among the ruins, there were signs of life. Women hanging laundry between broken walls, boys riding bicycles made from scavenged parts, an old man selling bread from a cart near what had once been a station platform. As the train slowed near Munich, Fisher felt a knot tighten in his chest. This was home, or what was left of it. The once proud city now looked like a patient in recovery, stitched together, fragile, breathing through the dust of its own rebirth. He stepped off the carriage into air, heavy with coal smoke and memory. The station was filled with displaced souls, refugees, widows, soldiers without insignia. Some wept when they saw familiar faces. Others simply stared, unable to bridge the gulf of years. Fisher stood among them, clutching the slip of paper that declared his repatriation complete, but it felt meaningless in his hands. He walked for hours through streets he no longer recognized. The cafe where he had once met his wife was gone. The bookstore that sold his favorite volumes of Rilke was now an empty shell, its windows covered with soot. At last, he reached the small neighborhood on the city's edge, where his house had stood. There was only an empty lot now, a patch of earth with wild grass and twisted beams. He sank to his knees. The silence was unbearable. Then he saw it, a fragment of the front gate, still standing, its paint blistered but faintly visible. He reached out and touched it, feeling the rough surface beneath his fingers. In that moment, the war's noise seemed to return. The rockets, the shouts, the collapsing walls, all echoing in his mind. But then, from somewhere nearby, came the sound of laughter. He turned. Across the street, a group of children were chasing each other through the rubble, their shouts carrying through the evening air. For a moment, he simply watched, the lightness of their movement, the defiance of their joy. It struck him that even in this wasteland, life had not surrendered. He sat for a long while, until the sun dipped low and the sky turned the color of steel. Then he rose, brushed the dust from his coat, and began to walk again. Not toward the past, but toward whatever future might still exist. In the months that followed, Fisher found work clearing debris for the Reconstruction Committee. It was humble, anonymous labor, but it suited him. Every stone lifted, every plank reset, felt like a small act of atonement. The Americans were still present in the city, engineers, aid workers, guards. And Fisher sometimes spoke with them in halting English. They treated him not as an enemy, but as a man simply rebuilding what had been broken. One afternoon, while hauling bricks near the Isa River, he heard a voice calling his name. He turned and froze. It was a Red Cross volunteer holding a letter. She smiled softly. "From your wife," she said. His hands trembled as he opened it. The paper was thin, the handwriting familiar but shaky. She was alive. She and their daughter had fled to Bavaria before the final bombardments. They were safe. They were waiting. Fisher read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and pressed it to his chest. The sounds of the city, hammers, carts, the hum of rebuilding, suddenly seemed distant. He walked to the riverbank and stood watching the water, fast and cold, rushing toward the horizon. For the first time since the war began, he allowed himself to smile. He would go to them. Not as Lieutenant Fisher of the Wehrmacht, not as a soldier, but as a man who had learned the price of survival and the quiet mercy of starting again. The world had burned, and yet here he stood, witness to its fragile recovery. The bazookas, the rockets, the endless thunder, they had ended nations and rewritten tactics, but they had not destroyed what made humanity endure: the simple will to rebuild, to forgive, to live. And as night fell over Munich, Fisher whispered to the wind, almost as if speaking to the ghosts of the fallen, "War took everything, but not the dawn." He turned toward the fading light, his silhouette merging with the city's slow rebirth. If this story moved you, subscribe to POW Tales, where every silence of war finds its voice again.